Undercover CEO follows his employee home after she begs for leftover food. What he discovered in that rundown trailer made him rewrite every company policy overnight. Michael Rivera had built his empire from nothing. 23 years ago, he was washing dishes in a kitchen just like the ones in his restaurants now. Back then, he knew what it felt like to count every dollar, to choose between rent and groceries, to smile through exhaustion because losing a job meant losing everything. But success has a way of creating distance, and somewhere between the corner office and the corporate jets, he had forgotten what desperation actually looked like. Until tonight. The email sat at the bottom of his inbox, almost lost among the usual flood of corporate communications and board reports. Most employee requests were routine, schedule changes, vacation approvals, payroll questions. But this one was different. It wasn't demanding. It wasn't even asking for much. It was almost apologetic. Would it be possible to take home any leftover meals after my shift? I understand if this isn't allowed, but I thought I should ask officially. Thank you for your consideration. Sophia Carter. Michael stared at the screen, his coffee growing cold in his hand. Sophia Carter. He pulled up her employee file. 24 years old, line cook, hired 14 months ago, perfect attendance record, never a single complaint, always stayed late when they were short-staffed, always the last to leave. But why was she asking for leftover food in writing? Most employees just grabbed something if they wanted it, or asked their manager casually. Why did she feel the need to make it official? Something about the formality of her request, the careful politeness, struck him as odd. Michael leaned back in his leather chair, looking out at the city lights through his floor-to-ceiling windows. His own dinner from the executive dining room sat half-finished on his desk. Premium steak, roasted vegetables, a bottle of wine that cost more than most people made in a day. He glanced at the clock. 10:47 p.m. Sophia's shift ended at 11. Without really understanding why, Michael grabbed his coat, shut down his laptop, and headed for the elevator. He told himself he was just curious, just making sure his employees were being treated fairly. But deep down, something was pulling him toward an answer he wasn't sure he wanted to find. The parking lot was nearly empty when Michael stepped outside. Through the kitchen's back door, he could see Sophia wiping down the last of the industrial counters, her movements quick and efficient despite the exhaustion that showed in her shoulders. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, strands clinging to her forehead from hours under the heat of the grills. A manager passed by, handing her a brown paper bag. She accepted it with a small nod, tucking it carefully under her arm like it was precious cargo. That had to be the leftover food she'd requested. Michael watched as she untied her apron, folded it with the same careful precision she brought to everything else, and grabbed a worn backpack from a hook on the wall. Then she stepped out into the cool night air and began walking toward the bus stop down the street. Michael hesitated. This felt like crossing a line, invading her privacy. But something about the way she carried that bag, the way she walked with purpose despite her obvious exhaustion, made him climb into his black sedan and follow. The bus was late. Sophia stood under the flickering streetlight, shifting from foot to foot, arms crossed against the night chill. When the headlights finally appeared, she climbed aboard without looking back. Michael kept his distance, tailing the bus through the city. At every stop, he expected her to get off, but she didn't. The further they traveled, the more the landscape changed. Gleaming downtown buildings gave way to older neighborhoods, then to areas Michael rarely saw except from highway overpasses. Streetlights grew sparse. Storefronts turned into boarded-up buildings. The city's prosperous facade peeled away, revealing the reality that existed just miles from his corporate headquarters. After nearly an hour, Sophia finally pulled the yellow cord. Michael parked at the far end of the street, watching as she walked with that same determined purpose through an area that made his chest tighten with unease. Chain-link fences, run-down houses, cars that looked like they hadn't run in years. Then she turned a corner and disappeared behind a row of parked vehicles. Michael pulled forward slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. When he rounded the corner, what he saw made his breath catch. Not an apartment, not even a small house. A trailer. Sophia stepped up to the door, balancing the paper bag carefully as she unlocked it. Inside, a dim light flickered on, casting shadows against thin, yellowed curtains. Michael stared in stunned silence. This wasn't what he had expected. This wasn't what he had expected at all. But what he saw next shattered every assumption he'd ever made about his employees' lives. 3 small figures emerged from the shadows as soon as Sophia stepped inside. Children. They rushed to her with the desperate enthusiasm of kids who had been waiting all day for their person to come home. Arms wrapped around her waist, voices overlapping in excitement despite the late hour. Sophia laughed softly, her exhaustion momentarily replaced by something warmer. She set the brown paper bag on a narrow counter that served as the trailer's kitchen. But before she could unpack it, an older woman appeared. Frail and slow-moving, with gray-streaked hair and shoulders hunched by years of hardship, the woman had to be Sophia's grandmother. Sophia gently helped her into a chair, speaking in soft tones, her hand resting briefly on her shoulder with a tenderness that made Michael's throat tight. Then came the moment that changed everything. Michael watched as Sophia carefully unpacked the food from the restaurant, dividing it onto 4 plates. Not 5. 4. The children dug in immediately, eating with the quick desperation of people who knew meals weren't guaranteed. The grandmother ate more slowly, her hands unsteady as she lifted the fork to her lips. And Sophia? She sat down with them, smiling and nodding as the kids chattered about their day. But she never took a bite. Michael leaned forward, his hands gripping the steering wheel. She was cutting her food into smaller pieces, moving it around on her plate, engaging with her family's conversation, but never actually eating. She was pretending, putting on a performance so convincing that the children didn't even notice. She was giving up her only meal to make sure they had enough. Michael's chest constricted. He thought about his own dinner that night, the expensive steak that he'd barely touched, left sitting on his desk because he'd been too distracted by emails to finish it. A meal that cost more than Sophia probably made in 2 days. And here she was, after working a 16-hour shift on her feet, pretending to eat so her family wouldn't worry about her going hungry. This wasn't just an employee struggling to make ends meet. This was systematic failure, and he was at the top of the system that had failed her. But Michael was about to discover that Sophia's sacrifice ran even deeper than he could have imagined. The oldest child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 11, looked up from his plate with concern in his young eyes. "Did you eat at work today?" I held my breath, watching Sophia's face. For just a split second, barely a flicker, her careful mask slipped. Then she forced that same tired smile and lied with practiced ease.
"Yeah, I had something earlier." The boy studied her face, clearly unconvinced, but he didn't push. He just nodded slowly and returned to his food. Even at 11, he was learning to accept the lies adults told to protect him from truths too heavy for a child to carry. Michael felt sick. This wasn't just tonight. This was a pattern. She had probably been doing this for weeks, maybe months. Getting up every morning, going to work, staying late, coming home with just enough food for everyone except herself. Inside the trailer, the children began showing signs of exhaustion, their earlier excitement fading into tired yawns. They shuffled toward what appeared to be a sectioned-off area in the back, their makeshift bedroom, in a space barely big enough for 1 person, let alone 4. The grandmother moved more slowly, settling into a worn recliner that obviously served as her bed. Michael counted the sleeping arrangements in his head and realized with growing horror that there was no bedroom for Sophia. Then he saw it. In the corner near the kitchen area, barely visible in the dim light, a thin mattress, not much thicker than a camping pad, with a single blanket folded neatly at one end. That was where Sophia slept. After 16-hour shifts, after standing for hours in front of blazing grills, after serving hundreds of meals to strangers who never knew her name, she came home to a mattress on the floor. Michael closed his eyes, trying to process what he was seeing. He ran a company that prided itself on being family-oriented. He sat in meetings where executives discussed employee satisfaction and competitive wages. He approved budgets that included corporate retreats, executive bonuses, and marketing campaigns that cost more than most people made in a year. Meanwhile, one of his hardest-working employees was homeless, hungry, and sacrificing everything for her family while he worried about quarterly projections from his corner office. The lights in the trailer flickered off one by one. Michael sat in the darkness of his car, staring at the silent structure, his mind racing. How many others were there? How many of his employees were struggling in silence, showing up with smiles while their worlds crumbled behind closed doors? He thought about the leftover food thrown away at the end of every shift, food that could have fed families like Sophia's. He thought about the waste, the excess, the comfortable distance he'd maintained from the real lives of the people who made his success possible. This wasn't just unfair, this was unacceptable. And Michael Rivera was done accepting it. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he needed. It rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Sir? It's past midnight. Is everything okay?" It was his head of operations, the person responsible for overseeing employee programs and policies. "No," Michael said, his voice steady but firm. "Everything is not okay." There was a pause on the other end. "What do you mean?" Michael glanced at the trailer one last time, thinking about Sophia sleeping on that thin mattress, about the children who'd eaten their first real meal of the day at 11 p.m., about the grandmother trying to find dignity in a recliner that served as a bed. "We need to fix this. All of it. First thing in the morning." He didn't wait for a response. He hung up because this wasn't a discussion, this was a decision, and Michael Rivera was just getting started. The next morning, Michael walked into his office with the kind of clarity that comes from seeing truth without filters. By noon, the entire company was in motion. First, the leftover food policy. No longer would perfectly good meals be thrown away at the end of shifts. Instead, they would be packaged and distributed daily to any employee who wanted them. No questions asked, no paperwork required, no shame attached. Second, an immediate wage review. Every full-time employee's salary was evaluated against the actual cost of living in their area. Adjustments were made on the spot, ensuring that no one working full-time would ever have to choose between rent and food again. Third, an emergency assistance program. Employees facing unexpected hardships could access immediate financial aid, no strings attached. Medical bills, family emergencies, housing crises, the company would be there. Fourth, and most importantly, Sophia Carter received a visit from her manager that afternoon. She was handed an envelope containing not just a significant raise, but also information about company-sponsored housing assistance and a childcare program that would help her build stability for her family. For the first time in months, maybe years, Sophia didn't have to pretend everything was okay, because finally, it actually was. Michael had walked into work that morning as a CEO focused on profit margins and market share. He left as a leader who understood that a company's true success is measured by the lives it changes, not just the money it makes. But here's what haunts him still. How many Sophias are out there right now? How many people in your own life are struggling in silence, too proud to ask for help, too afraid to show their pain? Look around you. That coworker who always volunteers for extra shifts, that neighbor who waves but never stops to chat, that person at the coffee shop who counts change twice before ordering. How often do we see someone asking for help and look the other way because it's easier than getting involved? If you have the power to help someone today, even in the smallest way, don't wait. Don't assume someone else will step up. Don't convince yourself it's not your responsibility. Because the truth is, we're all connected. And sometimes the difference between someone's breaking point and their breakthrough is simply knowing that someone sees them, someone cares, and someone is willing to act. What would you have done if you were Michael that night? Would you have followed her home? Would you have looked the other way? And more importantly, what are you going to do about the Sophias in your own life? The person sitting next to you on the bus, the cashier who serves your coffee, the coworker who always eats lunch alone. They all have stories you've never heard, struggles you've never seen. Don't wait for someone else to be the hero. Sometimes being human is heroic enough. If this story moved you, if it made you think about someone in your own life who might need help, don't just scroll past it. Share it. Talk about it. Use it as a reminder that behind every smile, there might be a story like Sophia's. And if you're the one struggling in silence right now, if you're the one sleeping on the floor so your family can have beds, if you're the one pretending to eat so others won't worry, please know that your strength is seen, your sacrifice matters, and there are people who would help if they only knew how much you needed it. You don't have to carry everything alone. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone else see your truth. What's your truth? And who in your life might be hiding theirs?